Welcome to Midnight Casebook, where every shadow hides a secret and every mystery begs to be solved. Tonight, we unravel the chilling tale of Father Brown and murder, Waited Behind the Crucifix, a fan-made story paying homage to the brilliance of G.K. Chesterton's legendary detective. We'd love to have you along for this enigmatic journey. Drop a comment to let us know where you're watching from, share your theories, and if you spot any inconsistencies, don't hesitate to call them out. Your keen eyes and sharp minds help us craft even more captivating mysteries in the future. Chapter 1. The Confession That Doomed Everything. She said she killed him, but the corpse was already buried when she arrived. The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days, when Miss Catherine Ashcroft walked into the confessional and shattered the silence of St. Sebastian's with 5 words. "Forgive me, Father. I lied." She wasn't shaking. Her voice was too even for a widow still dressed in mourning lace. The veil she wore was damp with mist, and yet clung to her face like a second skin. On the other side of the grate, Father Brown didn't move. Not at first. Because the strange thing was, he already knew who she was, and he already knew what had been found just this morning beneath the church floorboards. Catherine continued, as though time hadn't mattered, as though she'd been rehearsing her words since the coffin was lowered without a soul present, save for the gravedigger and the rector. "I told them I was with him that night. I told them we argued, and he left, that he never came back. But it's not true." Her voice thinned. "Because he never left." Outside, thunder rolled like an ancient organ in a forgotten cathedral. Inside the booth, Father Brown blinked slowly, and for a moment, just a moment, he remembered a different voice. Another woman, another lie, another man who never left. But Catherine was still speaking. "He bled, Father. He bled like something trying to get out of its own skin." The townspeople had heard the rumors, of course. Whispers curled around the marketplace like steam from fresh bread. A man gone missing, a wife who cried too softly. But it wasn't until the sexton found blood soaking through the old floorboards in the back vestry, a place no one had entered in years, that the police came, and they came without questions, only orders. No one expected the body to be intact, and no one expected it to be smiling. "Smiling?" Father Brown had asked when Inspector Halliwell told him. He was smiling. "Worse," the inspector replied. His lips were sewn shut. And so here was Catherine, not under arrest, but kneeling in a sacred space, confessing not to murder, but to deception. And in this village, lies were worse than death, especially lies told in God's house. But here's where it gets strange, because what Catherine described next didn't match the scene. She said her husband had fallen, tripped in the dark, cracked his head against the altar rail, bled everywhere. She said she panicked, covered it up, said nothing. But Father Brown had seen the wound. It wasn't a fall. It was precise, controlled, surgical. The kind of cut that doesn't come from panic. It comes from planning. And so began the unraveling. Because even though Catherine had come to confess, it was clear she was still lying. But why? Why come forward with a half-truth? Why risk everything, her reputation, her freedom, her soul, if not to reveal the whole story? Unless the truth was worse than the lie. Father Brown emerged from the booth and found her already gone. Just her scent remained, candle wax and old roses. He stepped into the chapel and noticed something no one else had mentioned. A faint symbol, carved into the wood of the pew behind where she knelt. Barely visible unless you knew where to look. A twisted figure 8, not a holy sign, not even a known one. But to Father Brown, it rang a bell. not from scripture, but from his past. Once, years ago, in Rome, he had seen that same symbol painted in dried blood on a monastery door. It was a mark of silence, of debts unpaid, of a secret order the church never acknowledged. And the last time he saw it, a cardinal had vanished. Back in the rectory, the fire had gone out. The kettle hissed with too much pressure. And yet, Father Brown stood by the window, staring at the chapel where Catherine had sat. He was replaying her words, her tone, the stillness. It wasn't remorse. It was strategy. Someone wanted that body found. Someone wanted Catherine to confess, but not to murder, to something else, to something only Father Brown would understand. The inspector returned that night with more questions and fewer answers. The body's lips had indeed been sewn shut, but the thread used wasn't ordinary. It was old, pre-1900s, of a style used only in funerary rites for heretics, the kind of burial given when someone was believed too dangerous to speak in death. Not criminal, cursed. Who would do that? Halliwell asked, voice hushed. Someone who feared the truth even more than the law, Father Brown said quietly. But then came the first break. A man, thin, gaunt, and wet from the storm, appeared at the chapel steps just past midnight. He had no shoes, no name, only a parchment, sealed in red wax, bearing that same twisted figure 8. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He simply handed Father Brown the scroll, bowed, and vanished into the storm. Inside the scroll, a single sentence. 1 sin leads to 7 graves. Father Brown didn't sleep that night. He paced the chapel in slow circles, counting pews, cracks in the floor, the marks only a trained eye would spot. He found 4 other carvings, hidden beneath the armrests. The same symbol, over and over, etched in, not recently, not by Catherine, not by anyone who had ever been named in this church's records, which meant the truth stretched back generations, which meant the body wasn't just a man, it was a warning. The next morning, the townspeople gathered for Sunday Mass. The rain had stopped, but the air felt too still, like the breath before a scream. Catherine did not return, but someone else did. A boy, no older than 17, pale, dressed in black, with a red thread wound around his finger like a ring. He sat in the very pew where the symbol was found. When Father Brown stepped to the pulpit, the boy smiled, then stood, then left, no words, just a smile. And where he'd been sitting, another piece of parchment. A name. Not Catherine's, Father Brown's. He didn't show the inspector. He didn't tell the altar boy. He simply folded it up and placed it inside the inner pocket of his cassock, next to the relic of Saint Dymphna, next to the old rosary he never used anymore, next to the medal he swore he'd never show again. Because the moment he read that name, he remembered everything. The monastery, the forbidden rite, the child who wasn't supposed to survive. And now he understood what Catherine had really done. She hadn't lied to cover a murder. She'd lied to protect the wrong murderer. Because the man buried beneath the church, he wasn't her husband. He never had been. And yet, his lips were sewn shut. Because if he could speak, he'd name someone else. Someone still alive. Someone watching. And just as Father Brown sat in the vestry, trying to breathe through the weight of it all, the candle beside him flickered. He looked up, and there, written in ash on the wall, "I told you he never left." He rose, slowly. His knees ached from years of kneeling, but his hands were steady. The chapel doors stood closed, but he knew, someone was behind them, waiting, not to kill, but to confess. And that's when it hits you, the viewer. Not who died, but what they took with them. The story isn't about the body, it's about the lie that led to it. The lie Catherine chose, the lie Father Brown once told himself. And now, in the deepest quiet of the church, where no hymn is sung anymore, you realize the murder isn't over, it's just beginning. And the only one who understands is a man who has already confessed more than once to things he was never supposed to know, to truths he was never supposed to hear. And as he whispers into the dark, "I know who did it," he doesn't finish the sentence, because he can't. Because if he does, it will doom everything again, just like last time. Chapter 2. Blood was hidden behind faith. The bishop's heart was still beating when they sealed him inside the altar. They said it was a miracle, that the old man's heart kept pulsing days after death, that the stone slab warmed beneath the hands of the faithful, that candles near the altar never flickered even when the wind roared through the old cathedral. But Father Brown knew something else, something darker, something the church would never allow to be written down. The morning began with ash, not the kind left from incense or penance, but the kind that clung to your skin like warning. The air inside St. Winifred's was heavy, almost oily, and though no one said it aloud, the priests moved more slowly, eyes cast downward. They avoided the pulpit, they avoided the chapel, and most of all, they avoided the altar. 2 days earlier, the bishop had vanished. There had been no announcement, no scandal, no whispered sins, just gone. His vestments still hung in the wardrobe, his keys still beside his bed, his Bible open to the Book of Lamentations, marked with a feather soaked in dried red. And then, late last night, when the candles refused to stay lit near the sacrament table, the sacristan had found something, a drip, like spilled wine, along the edge of the altar's base. But when he touched it, it was warm and thick, and it stained his fingers darker than any communion. They cleaned it, said nothing, told themselves it was rust from the old brass cross. But this morning, more appeared, not a drip, a trail, leading down, under, into the very stones of the cathedral. That was when Father Brown arrived. He had not been summoned, he had not been invited, but something in the air called him. And when he stepped inside, the silence welcomed him like an old confession. "Something's wrong," he said aloud, though no one stood near. "This church is sweating secrets." No one replied, until he walked past the altar and stopped. The floor was cracked, no wider than a hairline, but unmistakable, new, fresh, and beside it, the smallest thing, a nail, not old, still glinting, still red, and that was when the vision struck him. Not divine, not demonic, just memory. A boy, bound, buried in cloth and salt, and a voice chanting Latin that wasn't quite Latin. Fides, fides, prosanguine. Faith for blood. It wasn't the first time Father Brown had heard the phrase. Years ago, in an abbey far from here, a priest had been burned for whispering those words while blessing a child. They said he'd gone mad, said he believed the sacrament could only be holy if a bloodline was buried beneath the altar. A bloodline, not a relic, not a saint, a person, living, or barely. Father Brown dropped to his knees beside the stone, whispered a prayer, not for comfort, but permission. Then he lifted the cloth of the altar and ran his hand along the underside. There, a seam, not visible unless you knew to search, not new but not ancient either, and behind it, hollow. He stood, turned, saw the sacristan watching him. "Where is the bishop?" Father Brown asked softly. The man didn't blink. "He has ascended." Brown shook his head. No, he was lowered. That night, Brown returned alone, carried only a lantern, a crowbar, and a passage from the Apocrypha no longer read in mass. He moved in silence. No one dared follow. The cathedral groaned around him like a beast disturbed in its sleep. He wedged the bar beneath the corner of the altar. Pressed. Stone cracked. The sound echoed, loud and sharp, like a whip in an empty hall. He paused, listened. Nothing. Another press, another crack, and then the altar shifted. Just a little, but enough. And from the gap, a gasp. Soft, human, alive. Father Brown's breath caught. He reached for the lantern, lowered it. Inside the hollowed space beneath the altar, not more than 3 feet deep, lay a figure, wrapped in white, chest rising, eyes closed, but lips parted, and between them, a trickle of red. The bishop, still breathing, still bleeding, but silenced, bound by rites no scripture dared record. Father Brown did not touch him. He simply whispered, "What did they fear you would say?" And the bishop's eyes fluttered, and opened, and locked onto his. And in that moment, Father Brown saw something no man of faith should ever see in another priest. Terror, not of death, but of release. The next morning, the altar was resealed. No one spoke of it, no one asked. And when the congregation knelt before the stone that now housed a secret they'd never suspect, the candles stayed lit, but the air felt colder. Because now, Father Brown carried a question heavier than truth. What does a bishop know that the church would rather bury than forgive? The bishop's heartbeat, faint as it was, continued beneath the marble. Monitored by no one, sustained by means not medical, not divine, just hidden, like the blood trail wiped away, like the hymn never sung again, like the child that priest had blessed all those years ago, a bloodline, a legacy, a threat. And suddenly, Father Brown understood why the bishop had to be silenced. Because sometimes the greatest danger to faith isn't sin, it's memory. And the next time Father Brown returned to the cathedral, a letter waited for him in the sacristy, unsigned, unsealed. Inside, an old photograph, a child, crying, covered in ash, standing beside a man in bishop's robes. But the man wasn't the bishop beneath the altar. It was someone else, someone Father Brown had known, someone long thought dead. And beneath the photo, a single line written in that same almost Latin script. What was buried will speak again. He folded the photo, placed it in his coat, and as he left the church, he looked once more at the altar. Blood was hidden behind faith, he whispered, but faith cannot hide from the blood. And far behind him, beneath stone, breath rattled, and someone somewhere began to pray, not for salvation, but for silence. Chapter 3. He died holding the rosary. They say the rosary was still warm in his hands, even though the body had been dead for 3 days. The parish doctor couldn't explain it, neither could the coroner. But when Father Brown arrived, the beads were still coiled around the old man's fingers, soft as breath and smelling faintly of myrrh. Not decay, not time, myrrh. A scent not used in St. Catherine's since the Black Mass scandal almost 20 years ago. And the way his hands were clasped. It wasn't prayer, it was protection. Not for his soul, but for something else. Something he couldn't take with him, but refused to leave behind. The man was called Brother Matthias. Silent for nearly 2 decades, he lived in the bell tower and kept to the rhythm of prayer, 6 times a day, no matter the weather. He was a fixture, forgotten, revered, feared. No one remembered where he came from. No one dared ask, but everyone knew one thing. He never let go of that rosary, not even in sleep. And now, in death, it was still there, gripped so tightly it had cut into his palms. It wasn't the way he died that disturbed Father Brown. It was the way the body was found. Inside the sacristy. Locked from the inside. No sign of struggle, no blood, no trauma. Just the man's body, slumped in the corner beneath the fresco of St. Michael casting out the devil. Eyes wide open, mouth agape, and clutched in his hand the rosary that should have been buried with another man. A man who died 12 years ago. A man whose tomb, Father Brown knew, had been sealed with iron not to preserve the body, but to trap something in with it. Father Brown stood above Brother Matthias and whispered the first words of the Psalm of Deliverance, and the flame on the nearest candle flared blue. The mystery was already too thick to breathe. The death of a monk is rarely questioned. They die in prayer. They die in solitude. They die in silence. But this silence was different. It had teeth. The silence in that room wasn't peaceful. It was hiding something. Watching. The rosary itself was strange. Black beads, not jet, not wood, stone, but softer. Oily, like it absorbed light instead of reflecting it. And the crucifix, twisted, not malformed, deliberately warped. The arms of Christ bent inwards as if bracing for something, not redemption, punishment. When Father Brown took the beads from Matthias's hands, he hesitated, because the moment his skin touched the metal, something shifted in the room. The temperature dropped, but more than that, it felt like someone was breathing behind him. Not air, not cold, just presence. He turned. Nothing. But the door to the sacristy, locked only moments ago, was now wide open. And the blue candle? Snuffed. The investigation, if you could call it that, was slow. Purposefully slow. No one wanted this looked at too closely. The bishop was conveniently traveling. The warden of the church refused to speak. And when Father Brown asked to see the monastery's old relic logs, he was told they had all been lost in the fire. There had been no fire. Not recently. That was the first lie. And it wouldn't be the last. That night, Father Brown didn't sleep. He studied the rosary instead. Not the prayers, but the pattern. It was wrong. The sequence of the beads was not a rosary pattern. It was older, much older, pre-Christian even. He'd seen something like it once, in a cathedral in southern France, buried under stone so thick it was mistaken for a tomb. It wasn't a prayer tool. It was a map, a path, a key. To what? That was when the scratching began. Not loud, barely audible, but steady, coming from inside the rectory wall. Not the floor, not the ceiling, the wall. And it was coming from the side that faced the church. When he pressed his ear to the wood, he heard something beneath the scratching. A whisper, not in Latin, not in English, but he recognized the rhythm. The same rhythm Matthias had chanted every night before sleep. But now it was faster. Panicked, like someone reciting words to keep something away, or to keep it in. The next morning, the church groundskeeper quit without warning. His hands blistered, his hair singed. He said he touched something wrong in the soil. Said the ground behind the sacristy had gone soft, like it was breathing. They laughed, dismissed it. But when Father Brown walked back there, he saw the hole, small, fresh, circular. And at the bottom, another rosary, identical, still warm. He didn't touch it. Instead, he returned to Matthias's room, in the bell tower. He opened the drawer beside the cot and found a stack of journals, all written in the same tight script, not dated, not signed, but repeating the same thing, over and over. He came to ask forgiveness, but he never left. Page after page after page, he came to ask forgiveness, but he never left. And then, the last entry, scrawled in different ink, read one sentence. "If I die holding it, don't let go." That night, Father Brown did something he hadn't done in years. He dug, alone, beneath the altar, near the old foundation of the sacristy. He found the trapdoor, hidden beneath a slab of polished stone, etched with an angel's face, eyes missing. It wasn't locked, just forgotten, or purposefully erased. He descended into darkness, rosary in hand, each step echoing like thunder in a cave that hadn't heard prayer in decades. Below, the room smelled of iron. Not blood, rust, time, and something else. Something older. There were bones, arranged, not buried, like a ritual, but not Catholic, not even remotely holy. And in the center, an empty pedestal. Empty except for a chain. A chain that had once held something. Something the shape and size of a rosary. And on the far wall, etched into the stone with fire or acid, he who dies with faith in hand binds what should never speak. Father Brown turned and saw Matthias, not alive, not moving, but standing, propped up, held by wire and twine, like a guardian, a scarecrow in cassock and skin, mouth stitched shut, eyes missing. But in his chest, where the heart should have been, was the rosary, the real one, not the one found in his hand. A decoy. This was the relic, the original, still pulsing, still warm, not with life, but with memory. When Father Brown reached toward it, the room groaned, stone above shifted, dust rained down, and somewhere, above him, bells rang. But not the bell tower, funeral bells, though no funeral had been scheduled. And in that moment, he understood. Matthias had taken the relic from its pedestal, placed it in his chest, died to bind it with his faith, to keep it from returning to that room. But someone else had found it, removed it, placed a copy in his hands, and waited for Father Brown to come looking, because this wasn't a mystery meant to be solved. It was a door meant to stay shut, and now it was open. The bells stopped, the air changed, the relic pulsed once, twice, then went cold, and in the distance, from somewhere deep in the church, came a child's voice, laughing, just once, then gone. Father Brown didn't take the rosary. He didn't speak. He only backed away, sealed the door, and prayed, not to solve this mystery, but that it would never be solved. The next morning, the sacristy was empty. Matthias's body was gone, and on the altar, a single black bead, still warm. When the bishop returned the following week, he asked if the death had been peaceful. Father Brown simply said, "He died holding the rosary," and walked away, but he never touched his own again. Chapter 4. Father Brown suspects the priest. The body was still kneeling in the pew when they found it, hands folded, eyes wide open, and the priest's collar still clenched between its teeth. No one could explain how it happened. A man of 63, riddled with arthritis, murdered with such precise, quiet violence that no one in the cathedral heard a thing during morning mass. The body of Thomas Gray, the town's apothecary, was discovered just after the final hymn, frozen in a grotesque gesture of prayer, bloodless and stiff. What unsettled Father Brown most, however, was not the death, but the location, because Thomas was found in the very seat where Father Caleb always prayed, and Father Caleb was gone. Not absent, not sick, gone. At first they assumed he had taken ill. The altar boy said he hadn't come in for matins. The sisters whispered that his bed had not been slept in. But when Father Brown arrived and opened the priest's private study, the silence inside was louder than any scream. The curtains had been drawn, the chair overturned, and on the floor, in a pile of ashes, lay a single item, Father Caleb's stole. It was still smouldering. The mystery began to unfold with terrible elegance. Everyone in the village had a story about Thomas Gray. He was a generous man, but he was also a blackmailer. He gave free medicine to those who couldn't pay, but he never let them forget the debt. He knew secrets, had written secrets, and the rumors about the hidden drawer beneath his counter, about the locked tin in the cellar, about the time he made a man confess under threat of laudanum withdrawal, were whispered like superstition, not fact. But one thing was undeniable. Thomas Gray had dirt on everyone, even perhaps the clergy. Father Brown walked the grounds alone that afternoon, his eyes following the worn stone paths between gravestones and garden beds. He paused near the rear gate, where an old sundial stood tilted in the grass. Not by wind, not by time, by force. Beneath the base of the sundial, buried in damp earth, was a folded slip of parchment, written in ink now blurred by rain. He hides behind absolution. He bleeds behind the veil. And the signature below was the most disturbing part. It wasn't signed anonymous. It was signed Caleb. Not Father Caleb, just Caleb, stripped of title, of authority, of defense. Father Brown took the note to his study and read it again and again. The phrasing wasn't that of a priest. It was of someone outside the cloth, or someone who had stepped out of it. And the veil, not just metaphor, it was literal. In this cathedral, the confessional curtain had once been replaced, years ago, after a fire nearly consumed the box. Some said it had been arson, others an accident. But Father Brown remembered what no one else did. The fire started after a penitent left the booth sobbing, whispering the name Caleb. Father Brown returned to the confessional that night. He sat, waited, and listened. For hours, the church remained still, until just past midnight, when footsteps echoed against the stone, hesitant and soft. The curtain moved, and a voice, barely a whisper, spoke. "Forgive me, Father. I lied when I said I was faithful." Father Brown said nothing. His hand gripped the crucifix beneath his cassock. The voice continued. "I lied to protect him, but he never asked me to. I lied because I loved him, but I don't think he ever believed in forgiveness." The curtain trembled. Then, "He told me he'd rather burn than confess." And then the sound of something soft hitting the floor, a scrap of cloth, a letter, a lock of hair. Father Brown stood quickly, but the booth was empty. The curtain swung gently. No sign of the speaker, but on the floor, exactly as he suspected, was a charred corner of parchment. A confession, unsigned, half-burned. The words readable were few, but they were enough to shift the earth under the mystery. "If he dies, it's because I showed him the letter. He won't survive the truth. Not after what he did to that boy." The next day, Father Brown did something he'd never done before. He asked to exhume a body, not Thomas Gray. A boy named Elijah McCrae died 4 years ago. Fell from the bell tower, they said. No one asked questions. He was 17. No family left in the village. A closed coffin, quiet funeral, and buried on the outer edge of the cemetery, where the unconsecrated ground ends and the marsh begins. But Father Brown remembered something about that case, the silence around it, the way Father Caleb gave the sermon, eyes down, hands trembling, and the way the bishop himself had overseen the burial. Unusual, exceedingly unusual, but the request to open the grave was denied, flatly. No reason, just a letter stamped with red ink. No. So Father Brown returned to the cathedral, this time not as priest, as witness, and found what he feared. Inside Father Caleb's old chambers, behind a painting of the Virgin, was a hidden drawer. Inside, a stack of letters, all from Thomas Gray, each one dated, each one sealed with wax, and each one damning. Descriptions of meetings, of hushed confessions, of Elijah, of silence traded for favors, of blood traded for forgiveness, and the final letter, a threat. If you don't tell him I will, you've got until All Saints. Thomas died on All Saints' Day. And suddenly Father Brown no longer believed in coincidence. He no longer saw Father Caleb as missing. He saw him as hunted, or perhaps already dead. The next morning, the bell rang. Not the tower bell. The old handbell stored in the reliquary, rung only when a death occurs inside the cathedral walls. It had not rung in 15 years. Father Brown ran. But there was no body, only a trail of footprints, wet from rain, leading from the nave to the sacristy. And in the center of the floor, a priest's collar, torn, burned at the edges, still warm. He picked it up, turned, and saw that the confessional was open again. Inside, the body of Father Caleb, not dead, sleeping, mouth open, whispering, to no one, to something, repeating the same phrase, I kept your secret, I kept your secret, I kept your secret. But his hands, clasped around a dagger, the same dagger stolen from the relic case, the one said to have belonged to St. Stephen, the martyr, used in silence, not war, and on the blade, blood, not old, not his. Father Brown leaned in close, unsure if he was seeing a breakdown or a resurrection of something far worse, because Father Caleb's eyes snapped open, focused on him, and he whispered, Father Brown, what if you're the last secret I was meant to keep? And then he smiled, soft, mad, peaceful, and passed out again. And somewhere in the church, behind the walls, the handbell rang once more, by itself. And Father Brown, for the first time in years, felt afraid of what came next. He stood there in the dark, staring at the broken man, and said nothing. Because maybe the truth had been confessed, and maybe it had simply gone unheard. Or worse, believed. Chapter 5. The bell rang after death. The church bell rang 13 times, at midnight, 4 hours after. The man who used to ring it was pronounced dead. Not 11, not 12, 13. And no one was up in the tower. The villagers of Windermere were used to strange things. They had long accepted the black river that never froze, the shadows that moved faster than the light, the graves that sank a little deeper every Easter morning. But even they froze in their beds when the toll echoed across the valley, heavy and off-tempo, like it was being pulled by someone with trembling hands, or none at all. The bell had not been rung manually since 1894. It was now operated by a weight and pulley system hidden behind thick stone and iron bolts. Only one person had access to the mechanism, Mr. Elias Hartley, the church's official caretaker, 78 years old, deaf in one ear, known to walk with a limp, and found that very evening by Father Brown, slumped in the vestry, bloodless and cold. Yet the bell rang, and each note sounded like a warning, not a call to prayer, a countdown. Father Brown had only left the body for a moment. He had gone to fetch the inspector. When he returned, the door to the vestry was wide open, though he had locked it himself, and Hartley's hands were folded neatly over his chest. They hadn't been that way before, and his eyes, once sealed by death's quiet mercy, were now open, watching. Even the inspector paused. You sure he was dead? I don't doubt it, Father Brown said quietly, but something wants me to. The mystery spiraled faster than most. Hartley had been an orphan raised by the monastery. He had no family, no known enemies. Lived in a single room beside the bell tower, filled with drawings of clocks and bells, and a thick red book no one was allowed to touch. He kept a journal, but it was written entirely in reverse script, backward, like a child holding up a mirror to their secrets. It took Father Brown 3 hours to decipher one page. What he read didn't clarify the mystery, it deepened it. The bell must not be silent. Silence gives it breath. The old priest knew. That's why I took his tongue. Father Brown closed the journal slowly. The old priest, Father Rennick, had died 23 years earlier. Stroke, they said. But his body had been cremated without examination. Unusual, more unusual still. His final sermon was never recorded. The pages he had prepared were blank, but the congregation claimed they remembered every word. Identical words, same cadence, same tone. Even now, when Father Brown questioned them individually, they repeated the same sentence. He warned us not to sleep. The same sentence, not similar, identical. Father Brown began to walk the church grounds at night, listening to the bell tower, not for sound, for absence, because something was missing in the air, something only noticeable once it's gone. Stillness. The tower, even when silent, vibrated, as though it were waiting to be touched. And then the dreams began. Father Brown, always a man of reason even in faith, found himself waking with ash on his fingertips and the scent of burnt rope in his nostrils. Once he awoke to find a thin line of dust drawn in a perfect circle around his bed. Another time, the bell cord, sealed at the top of the tower, was resting across his window, though the glass had never been broken. And on the 6th night, he found a feather on his pillow, black, heavy, warm. He brought it to the altar. It disintegrated on contact. Elias Hartley's body was interred quickly, at the insistence of the bishop. But no service was held, no family to speak of, and Father Brown was told not to interfere, which is why, of course, he did. He returned to the vestry at dusk and removed the floorboards Hartley had always refused to let the altar boys clean. Beneath them, a hollow. Inside the hollow, another book. Not a journal, a ledger. Names, dates, and next to each name, one of 2 words. Asleep or rung. The most recent entry, Hartley, October 7th. Rung. The bell had rung 13 times. 13 souls in the ledger marked asleep, and Hartley had been the caretaker of that number. He hadn't been watching the bell, he'd been containing it. Or them. The next night, the bell rang again. 4 times. No one died. But in the morning, 4 graves in the northern quadrant had been dug up from the inside. The caskets were shattered, the corpses missing. No sign of struggle, no footprints. Only the sound, still echoing faintly from the tower, 4 chimes, trailing into breath. Father Brown no longer doubted what the bell did. He only questioned what Hartley had made it do, and why. He turned to the church records, the oldest ones sealed in lead boxes in the archives below the crypt. There, buried beneath dust and moth-eaten robes, he found a fragment of parchment, written in Latin and bound with wax. Translated, it read, "The bell does not toll for the dead, it calls the dying to rise." And scribbled beneath, in shaky English, "They rang it once before. The village burned." The year listed was 1621. Windermere had no records from that year. All had been lost in the fire. Father Brown closed the box and climbed to the bell tower. Each step felt like climbing into something alive. The air was thick, not musty, thick, like breathing through wool. The bell itself stood silent, but the mechanism, it had moved. The weights had reset. Impossible. Only Hartley knew how to do that. And beneath the bell, carved into the wood, newly, freshly, was a symbol. Not a cross, a circle, split into 13 segments, each one marked with a number, each one now inked red, except the last, still empty, waiting, and beneath it, one word, scratched as if with a nail, priest. That night, Father Brown dreamt he was ringing the bell, but the sound didn't go out, it came in, pulled from the earth, from graves, from memory, and he heard a voice, not human, but it used a human voice, and it said, "Ring me once more, and you will know what cannot die." He woke screaming, and beside his bed, Hartley's red book, though it had been buried with him, open to the final page, blank, except for a small note in the corner, written in Father Brown's own handwriting. "Don't ring it, don't sleep, don't be the 13th. And yet, he didn't remember writing it. The bishop arrived the following day, demanded the tower be sealed, the bell dismantled, destroyed. But when the masons came, they fled within an hour, not because of what they saw, but because of what they heard. The bell rang without moving, and all it said, over and over, "He is not done." The bishop resigned, vanished, left no trace, and Father Brown, he walks the church alone now, each night, one eye on the sky, one ear tuned to the bell, because he knows there will be one more chime, just one, and it won't call the faithful, it won't warn the village, it won't even wake the dead, it will name the 13th, and he's already wearing the collar. So when the final toll comes, and it will, remember this, the bell doesn't lie, but it doesn't speak the truth either. It only remembers what we tried to bury, and when it remembers you, you don't rest, you ring. Chapter 6, One Crucifix, Two Missing Witnesses. The crucifix was found buried in the garden, still bleeding. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, but bleeding, fresh, red, and warm. Its crown of thorns carved with maddening precision, its wooden surface cracked, and at the base, a single human tooth embedded like an offering. And beside it, nothing but 2 sets of footprints leading out from the chapel door and vanishing 10 steps later into nothing. The 2 men who made them. Gone. No trace, no struggle, no sound, no goodbye. Only the crucifix remained. And Father Brown, who should have been the 3rd witness, arrived 1 minute too late. The storm had broken sometime past midnight. The rain lashed the chapel windows like fingers desperate to be let in. It was meant to be a simple night, just a prayer vigil. Just 2 men, Constable Avery and altar boy Jonas Pike, taking watch over the relic known as the Vicar's Cross. It was nothing special, most thought, just another relic in the sea of forgotten sacred things. But it had been pulled from a sealed tomb 3 days ago, and strange things had begun happening ever since. Father Brown first noticed it when the bell rope burned through the sacristan's hand. The man hadn't been near fire, and the rope had been soaked from the rain. But when he dropped it, his palm was seared, blistered, like he'd touched molten iron. He swore he'd seen a figure inside the bell tower just before it happened, a figure kneeling, wearing robes, but not moving. And when they checked, there was nothing there. Then came the second sign. The water in the baptismal font turned black. Not muddy, not dirty, black, like ink, and floating in it, a single brass key. Father Brown recognized it immediately. The cellar, the one that had been locked since Father Mallory went mad and painted the walls with verses no one had ever read before, verses in Latin, but inverted, as if translated through a mirror. He took the key, but did not use it. Not yet, because that same day he received a letter, unsigned, unstamped. Inside was a single sentence: "If it bleeds, don't bury it." He had thought it nonsense, until now, until he saw the crucifix buried up to its arms in fresh earth, glistening like something living. And the men who stood over it hours earlier, gone. Avery's badge still hung from the chapel door, nailed in with 3 copper pins. Jonas's rosary beads had been wound around the altar so tightly they had bitten into the wood. No notes, no signs of escape, just absence. And something in the air, heavy, sweet, like frankincense gone rotten. Father Brown didn't speak for almost an hour. He just stood in the rain, staring at the crucifix, the blood pooling around its base. It hadn't rained hard enough for puddles, but the blood remained, thick, alive. He bent down, whispered a prayer, and touched it. It was warm. And when he looked back up, the footprints were gone, wiped clean. Not by wind, not by weather, but by something that wanted them gone. The investigation was quick and useless. No signs of struggle. No sign the men had even entered the chapel, despite witnesses seeing them go in. The relic itself, once placed beneath the altar, was now missing. The crucifix found outside was not the original vicar's cross. It was older, far older, carved from wood not native to England, made from a tree known only in Old Hebrew scripture as Ardol, meaning wood of listening. And deep in the grain, when examined closely, were etchings, tiny ones, not words, eyes, hundreds, all closed, except one, and that one eye followed Father Brown. Wherever he moved, he knew it was impossible, but impossible had already passed. That night, he opened the cellar, not because he wanted to, because he had to. The key fit. The door groaned open like it hadn't breathed in years. And on the walls, still there, untouched by time or mold, were the verses Father Mallory had written in his final days. But now they made sense, because they described something not in scripture, not in tradition, but in warning. The blood of the cross is not to save, it is to seal. Those who witness must speak, those who speak must vanish, and those who vanish return changed. Father Brown backed away, but he already knew the next part. He returned to the garden. The crucifix was gone, but something had been left behind. A note pinned to the soil with Jonas's rosary bead. He opened the eye. Father Brown didn't sleep. He prayed. He walked the chapel in circles, watching every shadow, until morning, when the bell rang, only once, soft, low, as if struck by a hand too small to hold the rope. And standing at the back of the church, Jonas, alive, or something wearing Jonas. His eyes were black, not the iris, the whole of them, and he smiled, too slowly, spoke too softly. Father Brown, he said, the crucifix didn't bleed because it hurt. Pause. It bled because it remembered. Father Brown didn't move, didn't blink. The thing that looked like Jonas turned and left, shoes leaving no trace, no sound. And as it passed, Father Brown saw something in its pocket, the same tooth found beside the crucifix, except now there were 2, and one was still wet. The inspector called it a miracle, said Jonas must have run off, hallucinated. He'd be checked at the infirmary. Father Brown said nothing, because in the corner of the chapel, beneath the old portrait of St. Augustine, there was a third footprint now, bare, small, like a child's, and next to it, a second crucifix, identical. But this one was carved with a mouth, open, screaming. And when Father Brown knelt to examine it, the screaming didn't stop, because it wasn't carved. It was coming from inside the wood. He closed his eyes, stood slowly, and whispered to the empty room, I know what happened to Avery, but I won't speak it, because if I do, he trailed off, turned toward the altar. and finished the sentence under his breath. "I'll disappear too." Somewhere behind him, a door creaked, and the chapel grew darker, though the sun had just begun to rise. Chapter 7. She whispered. Before she died. She was already dead when she spoke. Her lungs had stopped, her heart had ceased, the blood in her veins had cooled. And yet, as Father Brown leaned in to close her eyelids, her lips moved, not in breath, but in deliberate final motion. A whisper, 3 syllables, too faint to catch fully, too clear to ignore. And in that instant, the entire chapel went silent, as if the very air had paused to listen, as if even death wanted to hear what she had to say. The woman was Miss Eloise Markham, 42, midwife, respected, unmarried, and found on the floor of the rectory library with no visible wound, no signs of poison, and no cause of death that science could claim. Her eyes stared upward at a spot in the rafters where no candlelight reached. Her hand clutched a paper that had long since blackened, not burned, but as if the ink itself had rotted. And on the wall behind her, drawn in something darker than soot, was a symbol no one recognized, a crescent inside a square, with a line through the center. It looked like a child's sketch, but it felt ancient. She was discovered by Father Brown during his morning walk, a ritual he performed each dawn without fail. He was halfway through his usual prayer when he stepped into the library and felt the shift, the kind of stillness that doesn't belong to sleep or silence, but to something final. She was lying there, the light barely reaching her face, and for a moment he thought she was praying. Then he saw her mouth move, slowly, painfully, a whisper, a name, a word, a warning, and then stillness again. The town of Stonebridge was not a place for unnatural things, or so they believed, but the death of Eloise Markham shattered that illusion like stained glass underfoot. No autopsy could explain it. No medical theory could hold. The room was untouched, the door locked from the inside, and when the coroner arrived, the whisper was dismissed as muscular spasm. But Father Brown had leaned too close. He had heard something more, and the sound of it had chilled him, not just for what it was, but for who else seemed to hear it. Because as her lips formed that final word, the candle beside the altar guttered and then reignited, not from the wick, but from the center of the flame itself, as if called. Later that day, a note arrived at the church, folded into a triangle. No envelope, no signature. Inside were 5 words. Ask what she saw burn. Father Brown took no chances. He returned to the library, sat in the very chair where Eloise once taught Sunday school. The air was cold, unmoving. The room still carried her presence, not in scent, but in unease. And then he saw it, not the wall, the window. Scratched into the glass from the inside was the same symbol, the crescent in the square. But this one had changed. The line that bisected it now extended further, like a dagger thrust downward, fresh. And below it, barely visible, he watched. The question was no longer how she died. The question was, who was she looking at when she died? Eloise was not without secrets. She kept a ledger, a private one, tucked behind a false panel in her cupboard. Father Brown found it the next evening. Inside were names, dozens of them, women from the village, many he recognized, some he didn't. Next to each name, a symbol, a date, and the word either cleared or carried. But no one knew what those words meant until he found the last entry, dated that very morning, next to her own name. No symbol, just the word, whispered. The bishop arrived in the village the following day, said it was natural causes, said Father Brown needed rest. But Father Brown noticed the bishop's gloves, new, too thick for the weather, and on his ring, scratches, in the same shape as the window. The whisper haunted him, played back in his dreams, not a word, but a sound, like wind through cracked stone. And then the screams started. Not his, the villagers. The night after Eloise died, 3 women reported the same dream. They woke up at precisely 3:33 a.m., covered in sweat, unable to breathe, hearing a voice whisper in their ear, "I saw the child." Each one different in age, none of them related, except they were all in Eloise's ledger, each marked carried. Father Brown confronted the bishop, asked him what he knew of Eloise's work. The bishop denied everything, but as he turned to leave, a paper fell from his coat. Father Brown picked it up, blank on one side, but when held to the candle's glow, an image appeared, a sketch, the same symbol, but drawn in blood, and beneath it, witness of the veiled fire. There was only one place left to look, the old church vault, sealed since the 1800s, said to be unsafe, said to house relics unfit for display. But Father Brown knew the code. He had found it etched into the back of the lectern days before. Roman numerals, rearranged like a riddle. Inside the vault, the air felt wrong, like it hadn't been breathed in centuries. There were relics, bones, chalices, cloth, but in the far corner, a statue, crucified, but not Christ, a woman, mouth open, eyes hollow, one hand raised, and in that hand, a tongue, real, preserved, and underneath, carved in the pedestal, "She whispered before she died." And Father Brown finally understood. The whisper wasn't meant for him, it was meant for someone watching, something ancient, something that required silence as payment, something Eloise tried to warn them about, and failed. That night, the church bell rang 13 times. No wind, no hands, just sound, and the flame in the altar turned blue. Father Brown stood before the chapel mirror and removed his collar. Behind him, his reflection did not move, but its mouth opened and whispered, "She saw me." The next morning, no one could find Father Brown. Only a note remained, no name, no farewell, just a scrap of parchment, the symbol, and 7 words, "She died for what she saw burning." No one ever entered the vault again. Chapter 8. The Killer Who Knelt First. He was already on his knees when the murder happened, and the blood on his hands was still warm. The church doors hadn't even opened yet when they found him. The man who'd vanished for 12 years knelt quietly in the second pew, hands clasped as if in prayer, a smear of red across his cheek, and his mouth moving in silent penance. At his feet, a body, slumped, still, and very, very dead. The only witness, the killer himself. Except when the constable demanded an explanation, he looked up, smiled faintly, and said, "I was repenting before I sinned." No one knew what to do with that. His name was Dorian Hale, a name spoken like a curse in the village of Halberd Hollow. A man once accused, though never convicted, of burning down his mother's house while she slept inside. The trial fell apart for lack of evidence, and then he vanished, gone without a trace, until now, until he reappeared at dawn in the sanctuary of St. Ruth's Parish, kneeling beside the body of Father Elric, the town's only priest, whose throat had been cut with a liturgical knife, stolen from the altar. The blade was found beside Dorian, wiped clean. And yet, the blood still flowed slowly across the tiles, seeping into the cracks like it was searching for somewhere deeper to hide. Father Brown arrived just before sunrise. The constable had called him in desperation. "Not faith. He says things only you'll understand," he muttered, shaking. When Father Brown stepped into the chapel, the air was different. Cold, yes, but not the chill of October mornings. It was the kind of cold that lingers after a fire's been smothered, the kind that fills a room only after something has been taken. Dorian didn't look up this time. He just whispered, "I came to warn him," but he already knew. The mystery began not with the murder, but with the way the church bells had failed to ring that morning. The pull rope had been cut, not torn, severed cleanly. A single strand left dangling like a noose over the choir loft. And worse, there were no signs of forced entry. The chapel had been locked from the inside. Dorian hadn't broken in, he had been let in. And only one person had the keys: Father Elric. That's when Father Brown noticed the wax. Not from candles, from a seal. A broken one. The kind used to lock the reliquary beneath the altar. A seal that had not been touched since the Reformation. And beside it, dust disturbed. A single footprint, bare, small. Too small for Dorian, too small for any man. And then, the whispering. It began in the confessional. Not voices, breaths, shallow, rapid. Father Brown opened the door. Nothing, except a rosary. One bead missing, a single drop of blood on the crucifix, and carved into the wood behind the bench. He forgave before he asked. Father Brown turned to Dorian, who sat now calmly in the parish office, wrists unbound but unmoving. He had not tried to run. He had not spoken since his strange confession. But when shown the message carved in the confessional, he smiled again. "He told me," he said softly, "that forgiveness only matters if it's earned before the sin." Father Brown leaned in. "Who told you?" And Dorian, eyes wide now, voice shaking, not from fear but awe, replied, "The man in the other booth." "There was no one in the other booth," the constable interrupted. Dorian nodded slowly. "That's the point." Father Brown requested to see the reliquary. He descended into the vault beneath the chapel. The relics inside were untouched, save for one, a crucifix, bronze, twisted, reputed to belong to St. Morlan, a penitent who was said to have begged for absolution on the steps of a burning monastery before anyone knew the fire had started. The crucifix was missing, but something had been left in its place. A torn piece of parchment, stained, folded, with only one line written in Latin, "Qui genuflexit, judicavit." He who knelt, judged. Father Brown felt something inside him shift. Not horror, not understanding, but familiarity. He had seen this once before, in a seminary, long abandoned, a file, sealed, hidden. A case where a man murdered his confessor because he claimed the confessor had absolved him before the act and told him to carry it out. It was considered madness, a fluke, buried. But Dorian's words matched. And Father Elric, he had served at that seminary for 6 months, just before the fire that destroyed the western wing, and left only one wing intact, the wing that housed the confessionals. Father Brown returned to the chapel. It was empty now, but the air still vibrated. He sat in the booth, waited, and then breath, not his, and a voice, not Dorian's, soft, unfamiliar. "Will you still forgive me when you know what I've done?" He turned. Fast. No one there, just the mirror between the booths. And etched into the glass, "He forgave me first." Father Brown walked to the altar, traced the line where the reliquary had been disturbed, and saw, beneath it, a new crack in the stone, like something had been pulled from below or was trying to rise. The bell rope, still severed, swung slightly, though there was no breeze, and in the upper loft, the candle that had been unlit since Easter flickered on. He climbed, each step a question, each creak a warning. At the top, silence. Then, the faintest sound, knocking, from beneath the choir floor, rhythmic, measured, like a heartbeat. He knelt, placed his ear to the wood, and heard the whisper again. He knelt first. He stood, rushed back to the parish office. But Dorian was gone. No forced exit, no signs of struggle, just an open window. And on the desk, a crucifix, the missing one. But the Christ had been scraped away, leaving only the nails, still bloody, still warm. That night, the village did not sleep. The bells rang once, then again. No hands on the ropes, no mechanism turning, just sound, slow, grieving. And Father Brown stood in the doorway of the church, whispering to no one, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." Because the killer hadn't run, he had repented before he sinned, and someone, or something, had heard him. Chapter 9. A Prayer Interrupted by Murder. The scream didn't come after the murder. It came in the middle of the prayer. The congregation had just begun the Kyrie when it happened. 17 voices rising in reverence. Father Brown's own eyes closed in quiet concentration. The scent of old wood and fresh lilies floating through the chapel. It was supposed to be a morning of peace, of solemnity. Instead, it became a ritual soaked in blood. The sound tore through the sanctuary like a blade through cloth, sharp, unnatural, and ending so abruptly it left the air gasping. Everyone turned, everyone froze, but only one person screamed, and when they found her, knelt behind the final pew, her mouth still open in horror, her hands dripping red. It was already too late. Walter Crane, a banker, a skeptic, and a man who hadn't been to church in years, was dead. His throat had been cut. Not roughly, not in rage, precisely, silently. No one had seen a weapon. No one had seen the killer. And no one had even realized he was dead until the moment the prayer caught in the woman's throat, like a curse trying to stay hidden. The first problem was the pew. Walter was seated in a row that hadn't been used in over a decade, closed off for repair, warped floorboards, and missing bolts. Yet that morning, the ropes had been cut, the cushions dusted, the space made inviting. Someone had prepared the murder, not just with a weapon, but with ritual, with forethought. Father Brown walked the scene slowly. He did not ask the obvious questions. He did not check for blood trails or footprints. Instead, he looked at the candle, specifically the one left burning on the south wall, because it shouldn't have been lit. It was broken, the wick rotted, the oil long since evaporated, and yet there it was, flickering faintly, as though responding, as though waiting. The woman who screamed, Miss Harriet Vale, was too shaken to speak, but her hand remained clutched around something unseen, rigid, unmoving. When they finally pried her fingers open, they found only one thing, a small slip of cloth, torn from the robe of the man who had been murdered, but stitched into it, with red thread, were words no one could decipher. Not English, not Latin, not any modern script. And yet somehow Father Brown recognized it, because it matched a pattern he had seen once in a monastery outside Prague, on a wall that had been painted over 9 times, beneath centuries of plaster, a language not meant to be read aloud, a warning disguised as prayer. The authorities called it coincidence, the way Walter sat in that pew, the way no one saw his killer. But Father Brown had already spotted the greater problem. It wasn't that Walter was murdered in plain sight. It was that he wasn't supposed to be there at all. He hadn't come for service. He hadn't come for God. He had come for something else. And the clue sat in the small, coin-sized indentation beneath the pew, a hollow, barely noticeable, but when pried open, it revealed a tiny brass charm, shaped like an eye, closed, not ornamental, not religious, protective, meant to seal something in. And now it had been broken. The woman began to speak again by noon. Just one sentence, over and over, her voice raw with fear. He said it wouldn't happen in God's house. They asked her who. She wouldn't say, just repeated it again, then wept until her voice disappeared again. Father Brown searched Walter's home that evening, not by order of law, but by instinct, and what he found changed the shape of everything. A journal, not hidden, placed purposefully on the nightstand, opened to the final entry. I will sit where he sat. If the seal breaks, we'll know. If it doesn't, I'll confess. But the page before that was torn, not carefully, desperately, as if Walter himself hadn't wanted anyone to know what came before. Father Brown traced the torn edges and found faint marks, a pressure from the missing page. When shaded with pencil, the imprint revealed a list of names, 5 of them, all crossed out, all dead, and beneath them, his own name, not crossed out, just underlined, 3 times. The priest's breath stilled. He took the journal to the church crypt, where records of all ceremonies, past and private, were kept. And there he found something disturbing. Each name in Walter's book had been involved in a particular service, one that hadn't been documented officially, a funeral, a child's, one no one in the town remembered, one never published in the bulletin, but signed by the former priest, Father Elric, dead now, another name that should have been in the journal, but wasn't. Because Elric hadn't participated in the rite, he'd presided over the burial. But the baptism, Walter had performed it, illegally. He had stood as godfather to a child who, according to all records, never existed. And now he was dead, killed during prayer. The charm beneath the pew, the warning stitched in cloth, the missing child. Father Brown now saw the shape of the mystery, not as murder, but as penance. Someone wasn't killing to silence. They were killing to wake something up, and the church itself had been chosen for a reason, because some things can only be broken in places that were once holy. That night, the church bell rang only once, at 3:06 a.m. No wind, no weight. Father Brown stood beneath it, staring into the rafters, and saw a shadow move, not across the wood, inside it, as if something were trapped beneath the grain, watching, waiting, praying. The next morning, another slip of cloth appeared, pinned to the chapel door. Same red thread, same strange symbols, but this time translated below. The 9th shall open the eye, the 10th shall weep. They counted the names in Walter's book again. There were 9. Father Brown was the 10th, the next to pray, and the next to die. He entered the chapel that night, alone, lit the candle that never burned out, knelt, spoke the Kyrie once more. This time, his voice didn't waver, but the floor beneath him did, a faint vibration, not of footsteps, of breath, rising, and behind him he heard the whisper, the same one Harriet had heard, not words, but regret, the kind that lives in the bones of a place. He turned. No one was there, but on the altar, where no one had placed it, lay the charm, the same brass eye, open and wet. He didn't touch it. He didn't run. He simply whispered to the air, "I know who killed him." Then he paused, looked upward, and said softly, "But the truth is older than guilt," and the eye blinked. And once, Chapter 10, only Father Brown saw blood. There were no wounds, no bruises, no broken bones, just a man lying dead on the chapel floor. And only Father Brown could see that he was covered in blood. It wasn't metaphorical. The blood was everywhere. Slick on the tiles, pooled beneath the altar steps, streaked across the man's collar like he'd been dragged through his own final confession. But to everyone else, the scene was clean, peaceful, untouched. The doctor declared natural causes. The constable called it a sudden collapse. The choir continued rehearsal. No one saw what Father Brown saw, and when he pointed to the blood, even gestured toward the red-soaked hem of the man's trousers, they stared at him with worry. There was nothing there. The man was Edward Langley, an accountant by trade, but a man known more for his silence than his service. He had never missed a Sunday, never volunteered for communion, never confessed, not once. And now he was dead, alone, with no sign of injury and no trace of explanation, except for what Father Brown saw: blood, still warm, still fresh, and no one else could see it. They carried Langley's body out through the side door, while parishioners filed in for Mass. Father Brown followed them, eyes scanning the ground. The blood trail led out into the garden path, then stopped. Not faded, not smeared, stopped, cut clean, like a rope that had been severed. And that was when he noticed it. A single petal lying on the stones, white, stained with red. Not just red, moving red, as if the stain pulsed, like a heartbeat. He bent down to touch it, but before his fingers could reach, the wind lifted the petal and carried it into the sky, where it vanished. Back inside, the parishioners prayed, but something in the chapel had changed. The candles flickered in time with something unseen. The pews creaked without pressure, and beneath the altar cloth, the wood began to darken, slowly, as if absorbing something spilled long ago. Father Brown did not speak of the blood again, not yet. He knew better than to question madness while the scent of it still lingered in the air. But he did return to Langley's house. The constable allowed it, a courtesy more than an investigation. Langley had no family, no next of kin, just a set of locked drawers and a cellar with stairs that creaked like broken bones. Father Brown opened the drawers first, found journals, blank, dozens of them, all dated, none written in, except the final one, and in that, only one page. He asked me to watch the blood. I thought he meant guilt. Beneath it, a drawing, a circle with 3 dots inside, each dot marked with a name. 2 were scratched out. The third was untouched. Brown. He turned to the cellar. It was cold, too cold for October. At the base of the stairs, a small statue, hidden behind crates, carved from wood so dark it looked burned. A crucifix, but wrong. The figure hanging from it had no eyes, and the wound on its side, where the spear had pierced Christ in traditional depictions, was open, empty, as if something had once rested inside, and below it, carved into the base, "He bled for them, not for you." Father Brown returned to the chapel that night. Alone, he waited until the moon struck the stained glass window at just the right angle, and then he saw it again. The blood, fresh, trailing from the altar, pooling beneath the third pew. But this time, there were footprints, bare, pointing away, toward the back of the church. He followed them. Each step matched with a memory, a name. All people who had died over the past year, all sudden, all unmarked, all declared peaceful, and each one, Father Brown now realized, had visited the chapel the night before their death, sat in the same pew, prayed the same silent prayer, and each one had left no sign, except for the blood only he could see. It wasn't guilt, it wasn't hallucination, it was warning. He traced the steps to the confessional. The door creaked open, and inside, Langley's handkerchief, folded, wet, soaked in red, still warm. He did not touch it. But he did whisper, not a prayer, a question. "What do you want me to see?" And from the back of the booth, where no one had ever carved, came a single drop. Not water, not wax, blood. Real. He reached for it, and the floor groaned. The chapel shifted, and the handkerchief vanished. Only the scent remained. Not copper, not flesh, something older. He turned to leave, but the statue of St. Anthony near the font was gone. In its place, a white petal, dry now, and beneath it, carved into the tile, "You see it. That's enough." The next morning, the priest's robe, Father Brown's own, hung outside the sacristy, drenched in red, though it hadn't been worn and hadn't been touched since the day before. The bishop arrived by noon. He demanded answers. Father Brown said nothing, only handed him Langley's journal. Let him read the single sentence. The bishop scoffed. "Guilt," he said, "a metaphor." Father Brown only nodded, and when the bishop turned, Father Brown saw something he hadn't expected, a stain on the bishop's collar, faint, red, like a whisper trying to take shape. The next night, the church was empty, completely. Even Father Brown stayed away, because in the silence, something had begun to echo, a sound no one could explain. A soft drop, like rain on wood, but rhythmic, measured, endless, and only Father Brown knew what it meant. Only he saw where it led, and only he, still kneeling in the dark, whispered, "I know who's bleeding," then paused, and added, "But they haven't died yet." Chapter 11. He forgave what others missed. He walked into the funeral, whispered something into the widow's ear, and she dropped the murder weapon at his feet. It wasn't a trick. It wasn't a staged confession. There was no pressure, no cross-examination, no plea for absolution. Just a whisper. And then she collapsed, sobbing into her hands, as the silver letter opener she had used to slit her husband's throat clattered to the stone floor of the nave, barely a foot from Father Brown's shoe. The congregation gasped. The constable froze. But Father Brown did not move. He simply closed his eyes, folded his hands, and murmured, "She's not the only one who did it." And that was how it began. The death of Arthur Bellamy had already shaken the parish to its bones. A philanthropist, a lecturer, a man of order and legacy. He had been found in his study, slumped across a desk, eyes wide open, mouth stretched as if mid-curse or mid-prayer. A single wound, no blood trail, no forced entry. And a glass of water, untouched, still sitting at his left hand. The police ruled it a targeted act of domestic rage. His wife, Margaret, had no alibi. Her fingerprints were everywhere, but something about it never sat right with Father Brown. It wasn't the death, it was the quiet. Arthur's house had always been filled with sound, clocks ticking, radios humming, pipes hissing with heated air. But when Father Brown walked through the study for the first time after the murder, there was none of it. No echo, no creak. It was as if the room itself had been sealed, silenced, not by grief, by guilt. And when he touched the back of the old chair, where Arthur used to sit, he found something strange, a small curved groove, carved not into the wood, but into the leather, scratched by a fingernail, repeated over and over, as if someone had sat there every night, tracing the same invisible circle while trying to remember what they forgot. Father Brown didn't question Margaret that day. He didn't ask her if she'd done it. He only asked her where Arthur's final confession was. She went pale. "There was none," she whispered. Father Brown shook his head. "That's not possible. Arthur was a man who feared hell more than loneliness." "Still," she insisted, "no final prayer, no priest called. He didn't believe he had time." But Father Brown knew that wasn't true, because 3 days before Arthur died, someone had slipped a sealed envelope into the church's votive box. No return address, no markings, only a short note inside. I have forgiven her. Will he? The handwriting was Arthur's. The date matched. But the strange part? The envelope had been sealed using wax from a candle, not sold or used anywhere in town. Black wax. Rare. Expensive. Funerary grade. Used only for oaths, not letters. That's when Father Brown began to look closer, not at the murder, but at the things that led up to it. And what he found made no sense. Arthur had recently revised his will, removed his wife's name from everything, and yet he left her the house, not as an asset, as a punishment. He wrote in a side note, never legally registered, she will stay. She will hear him every night until she remembers what she watched. Him? That word echoed. Not me, not God. Him. And beneath the floorboards of Arthur's study, Father Brown found something buried. A bundle of clothes, children's clothes, burned at the sleeves, singed at the collar. Wrapped in them, a book, a ledger, entries dating back 20 years, children's names, all with red crosses through them, except one. No name, just initials. S.J. and the word forgiven. Father Brown returned to the church, lit a candle no one ever used, the one by the old statue of St. Jude, patron of lost causes, and for a moment, just a breath, the wax burned black. He didn't blink, he only knelt. Because now he knew. Arthur hadn't been punishing Margaret. He had been protecting someone else, someone neither the police nor the public suspected, someone who knew how to make things look like rage when they were actually redemption. That night, Margaret came to confession. She sat in silence for 20 minutes before saying anything, and when she spoke, it wasn't an admission of guilt, it was something else, something worse. I thought it was over, but then he said the name. What name? Father Brown asked. She didn't answer. She just left. And the next morning, a man was found dead in the cemetery. Face down, hands bound, no wounds, no identification, only a ring. With the initials S.J. Father Brown knew what the others missed. This was no random death. This was a story continued. A prayer interrupted, a judgment delayed. He returned to the votive box, found another letter. This one short, final. He forgave what others missed. I never will. That evening, Father Brown walked alone to Arthur's grave and found Margaret kneeling beside it, whispering something into the earth. He didn't interrupt. He waited until she stood, her hands red, not with blood, with wax, black wax, melted across her fingers like scars from promises she couldn't undo. She turned, looked at him, and said, "It wasn't me." Father Brown nodded once and replied, "I know who it was, but the truth will never be told." And somewhere behind them, in the chapel, the candle went out, by itself. Chapter 12. The final blessing was poisoned. The old man died with a smile on his lips and venom in his veins, slipped into the chalice by the priest who blessed him. No one suspected anything at first. It was a peaceful service, small, reverent, a final communion for Albert Finch, war hero and devout parishioner, whose body was slowly surrendering to cancer. He asked for the sacrament, not out of fear, but of faith. His final wish, to receive the Eucharist beneath the same roof where he'd married his wife, baptized his son, and buried them both. Decades later, the candles burned steady. The choir sang low. Father Brown stood silent at the rear of the nave, a guest for once, not the celebrant. And it was Father Raymond who administered the rite, hands steady, voice calm. No tremor, no hesitation. And when the bread touched Albert's lips and the wine met his tongue, it all seemed exactly as it should be. Until 27 seconds later, when Albert gasped, then collapsed, eyes wide, blood leaking from the corner of his mouth like wine poured in reverse. The service ended in chaos, but the stillness afterward was far worse. Father Raymond was the first to kneel beside the body. He wiped the man's brow, murmured a prayer, and reached for the chalice. But Father Brown stopped him, because he had seen it. A shimmer at the lip, not oil, not water, something thicker, iridescent, something that didn't belong in a chalice used only for consecrated wine. The coroner's report said cardiac arrest, but Father Brown insisted on a toxicology test, and 3 days later, it came back. Belladonna. The dosage was precise, enough to paralyze, enough to kill, and hidden in such a way that it would have been undetectable if not for Father Brown's eye. No fingerprints, no trace, just death, masquerading as sacrament. Father Raymond swore he had poured the wine himself, from a sealed bottle stored in the sacristy cabinet. As always, he swore he hadn't left it unattended. He wept when he said it. But Father Brown knew better, not because he thought Raymond guilty, because the bottle had already told the truth. When uncorked, it hissed, as if something had been released. Wine does not hiss, gas does, pressure does, and that kind of pressure only builds when something is added. The bottle had been tampered with, but not recently. The cork was old, soaked, molded. Whoever poisoned Albert Finch hadn't done so that morning. They'd done it weeks ago, and waited for the moment the wine would be chosen. The day, the hour, the cup. That was the beginning. But the question was, why Albert? Why now? He was no longer powerful, no longer feared. Just a man, waiting to meet God. Unless he was never meant to drink it. Father Brown returned to the sacristy, examined the cabinets, measured the dust. The bottle used was not the frontmost. It had been pulled from the back, buried behind two others, which meant someone had intended for it to be overlooked, to be chosen only when all else ran out. And that made it a trap. But a trap for who? Albert or the priest? Father Raymond had celebrated every Mass for 2 months without incident. But that morning, he'd almost called out sick, and Albert Finch had insisted he receive communion that day, not the next. He had rushed the sacrament, pushed for it, chosen his moment too perfectly. Father Brown returned to the church archive. Albert Finch's file was thin, but his confessions were detailed. Years ago, he had written a letter to Father Mallory, the priest who had served before Raymond. A letter marked private, to be read only upon my death. The envelope was never opened, the seal intact, but when Father Brown held it to the candlelight, the ink showed through just enough. One word, scrawled large in the center. Confession. He opened it. Inside, 2 pages, shaky handwriting, but deliberate. And what it contained was not confession. It was accusation. 3 names, all men Albert claimed to have betrayed during his time in the war. Each one had vanished under suspicious circumstances. Each one had a connection, not to the military, but to St. Germain's Church. 2 had once served as altar boys. The third, a seminarian. All had ties to Father Raymond's mentor, Father Mallory. All had been buried by the church, without autopsy, without question. And in the margins of the letter, Albert had written one last line. I took from him what he couldn't bury, but he'll bless me anyway. He always did. Father Brown's blood turned cold. This wasn't a murder of vengeance. It was a final act of repentance, twisted, targeted, calculated. Albert Finch had poisoned the bottle, not to kill himself, to force the truth out, to destroy the last mask before he died, to end what had begun decades earlier. And now, Father Raymond, the only man who never saw it coming, stood accused by association. But the poison had been meant for him, not Albert, because Albert had written a second letter, filed not in the church, but in his lawyer's safe, discovered only when the estate was opened. It read, "He always forgave, even what others missed. He won't forgive this, and neither will I." And beneath that, a drawing of the chalice, split in half, blood on one side, ash on the other. When Father Brown asked Raymond why he'd kept the bottle in the back of the cabinet, the man broke down. He said he never used it, said it belonged to Mallory, a keepsake, a tradition passed down, a symbol of continuity. But Mallory had died long before that bottle had arrived, and the label, dated to the year the last seminarian vanished. This wasn't just revenge, it was ritual, a final blessing, turned into judgment. Albert had orchestrated his death to unearth what no one else could. And when the bishop arrived to silence the scandal, Father Brown handed him both letters and said only, "Whatever comes next should have happened years ago." The bishop didn't speak. He only lit a candle and placed it beside the bottle. Still full, still deadly, still waiting. Later that night, Father Brown knelt at the altar, alone. As he often did when the world grew too quiet, he looked to the rafters and whispered, "I know who did it," then paused, then closed his eyes and whispered, "But the truth will never be told."